What's up everybody, Nate here. Ever since 2020 and the housing market boom, that has meant that housing values have skyrocketed all throughout the United States, and this is creating an affordability problem for everyday Americans. And now millions of Americans are being pushed out of the housing market and into renting. But this has caused a big supply problem in the renters market, and now rent is becoming unaffordable for just about everyone. The Biden administration recently put out a renters bill of rights for the entire United States, where they outlined what they were going to do to sort of address this problem. They outlined the problems in the renters market right now and what exactly they're going to do in order to keep prices from getting out of control and to stop landlords from raising prices. Now, the whole goal of this renters bill of rights from the Biden administration is to provide renters with access to safe, quality, and accessible affordable housing and have clear and fair lease expectations for the entire country. Pretty much no matter where you go in the United States, housing is really hard to come by. And like I said before, with people suddenly being pushed out of the housing market, now they're being forced to rent, but we just don't have enough supply, and that means that housing prices for renters has skyrocketed. Some are now spending 30 to 50% of their entire income on their rent every single month, and that is a huge problem because Americans have other things that they need to spend money on, like their debt, their bills, their investments, and pretty much anything else that they want to spend money on. They can't do that, and they can't flood money back into our economy if they're spending most of their income on rent. And this housing crisis that relates to renters didn't really get kicked off until about the mid parts of 2021. During the pandemic, many people were sort of stuck in their renter situation, and they weren't able to pay their bills because we had economic lockdowns and incomes were sort of dropped from there. However, the federal government decided to step in and provide programs that essentially blocked landlords from evicting people if they couldn't make their payments during that time. We also had things like the mortgage moratorium program, so that meant that people got relief by not having to make their mortgage payment, and millions of Americans needed that because they didn't have a job because our economy was shut down. Similar protections actually hit the renters market, and actually renting a home or an apartment actually became really affordable in 2020 and in parts of 2021. Our entire country was kind of going through it for a very long time, and that meant some huge cultural changes and shifts in people throughout the United States. Big cities like LA and Austin and New York were starting to see an exodus of people, well, because people were figuring out that they could get a whole lot more if they moved out of the city. So you had people in New York moving out of the city in mass and going to the suburbs because interest rates were really low, and they were using those New York paychecks in order to get a bigger house. Not only that, but we had work from home, and many people in New York or LA or any big city for that matter, well, they couldn't really work from home because they may have just had a one-bedroom apartment or they shared an apartment, and that really wasn't conducive to the work from home lifestyle. So what exactly did that mean? Well, we had a big burst in the housing market, right? All of these Americans essentially swapped over to working from home because nobody was going to the office for a certain period of time, and people basically started to live at home for a long time. Rent prices went way down because of that. Nobody really wanted to rent an apartment or a house, especially in the big cities. Like in Manhattan, rent prices hit a record low because they just had so much supply and pretty much no demand. Obviously, though, not everybody was able to move. There were still millions of people in these big cities and suburbs and everywhere for that matter that had to stay in their apartment or just move to a different apartment. So they were still renting. At the time, they got kind of a discount because there weren't as many people overall who were renting in the United States, and that was a good thing. In addition, we had stimulus checks, which did help Americans to pay their rent for a very short period of time. All of that sort of culminated in renters sticking it out where they were, saving money at first, but then we sort of had this inflation problem. Inflation affects everything. It affects the value of your money, and now you need a whole lot more money in order to go out and buy all of the same things. That applies to cell phones, and it also applies to housing. Once inflation got really, really bad in the United States, well, inflated housing prices were taking over the market. Now you didn't have nearly enough supply in order to meet demand, and at the end of the day, millions of people just could not afford to go out and get a house, but they have to live somewhere, and that meant that they were going to start renting. Slowly but surely, we started to see a flood and a new influx influx of people into the renters market. Once things started to open back up and our economy was open once again, people started to move back to cities, and Manhattan rent prices and rent prices in LA and Austin and all of these different places started to once again go up because they were a hot commodity. But inflation didn't just simply go away. In fact, we're still dealing with huge inflation problems as of today. Inflation in the summer of 2022 hit an over 40-year high of 9.1%. Today, it's much less. It's only at around 6.5%, but that is still extremely elevated, meaning that everything is going up in price. And because everything is going up in price, that includes housing. When you go to buy a home, there is a lot to consider in that home purchase. You have your mortgage, you might have some taxes and insurance that has to go into an escrow, you might have closing costs, and you definitely have a down payment. So this is tens of thousands of dollars that Americans have to put down when they go to get a mortgage. For the most part, Americans get a 30-year fixed mortgage, which means the interest rate on that loan is never going to change over the lifetime of the loan. However, there are other associated costs in getting a home, and one thing that a lot of people don't consider is how taxes and insurance are going to change over time. More often than not, they're going to go up because the value of your home consistently rises. Now, that's not to say that the value of your home is always going to go up. Like in 2008, we saw home values plummet, but right now in this economy and in this market, home values are going up. They're kind of slowing down from the record highs set last year and in 2021, but they slowly but surely are rising. That means Americans have to pay more in taxes and insurance every year. You have a more expensive home, which means you have more that you need to insure, and your property taxes go up because your home is more valuable now. So that affects mortgage owners and that affects homeowners. And you're probably thinking, well, then how exactly does that affect renters? Well, all of those associated costs are rolled into rent every month. Now, if that was solely the issue, I don't think a lot of Americans would be complaining about their rent going up because it wouldn't be a huge drastic increase unless their property suddenly jumped up a few $100,000 in value. Chances are the growth in value is not extremely significant, so it shouldn't be several $100s more every month, but we're seeing renters pay $500 to $1,000 in some cases every single month extra in their rent just because of inflation. Well, this is because when you enter into a contract with a landlord, you have to meet certain parameters, and those parameters change per landlord. Some landlords are going to say that you as a renter have to make 10 times the rent in order to live in that property. Some say that you have to put down a certain deposit on the property when you enter in an agreement. A lot of Americans can make that rent work, even accounting for inflation, but they're not able to get into an apartment because the landlord says they have to make 40, sometimes 50 times what the monthly rent is. That is to protect the landlord and to make sure that you have the available funds and the available money if something goes wrong. Because this real estate property is probably their business as a landlord, they have to be protected. So they want you to make as much money as possible so that way, in case you lose your job, you are still able to pay because you're able to put money aside for investing and saving. In this economy right now, landlords are trying to be as protected as possible because they have a feeling, because the Federal Reserve is raising interest rates, because people may end up losing their jobs, because businesses are cutting costs, that could mean that an influx of people suddenly stop paying their rent. If that happens, well, then people get evicted, and nearly 1 million people every single year are evicted from their homes in the United States. So the problems that we're facing in the renters market right now are twofold. We have inflation, and then we also have all of the federal protections ending. As inflation sort of eats away at everyone's paychecks, well, that is a big problem because now people are putting even more money aside towards their rent, and it doesn't really matter where they go, the rent is really high. Not to mention, we don't have enough supply right now in order to meet the demand because all of these Americans are getting pushed out of the housing market because of one thing: interest rates. The Federal Reserve is trying to fight inflation right now by raising its benchmark interest rates, which makes it a lot harder for people to qualify for a mortgage. High interest rates and home unaffordability has made it so people are going into the renters market. So inflation and supply is making landlords raise prices and raise prices and raise prices. And sooner or later, people are just not going to be able to afford them. The second problem is all the federal protections, like the moratoriums that were in place where people didn't have to pay their their rent if they didn't have a job or couldn't afford it are pretty much no longer in place. So people can now once again get evicted, and that creates competition that only continues to raise the price up even more because you have existing renters getting kicked out of places, and then the rents get reset to new market values. Now people are competing for those values and they can barely afford them at that rate. What this new bill from the Biden administration would do is any federally financed homes that are being rented out by a landlord, they will not be able to raise their rent prices at egregious levels anymore. That is because the loan that a landlord used to buy this property is federally backed, which means the United States government technically owns that property and they can do with it what they want. So if they decide that a rent price is getting too high for a particular property, then they're going to have to force that landlord to drop the price. The bill would also make landlords have to give a renter at least 30 days notice before evicting them from their property. When you have a mortgage, the eviction process is very long and very drawn out. It can literally take 6 months to a year to evict somebody from a property. Renters don't have those same protections, but this bill would provide that. Now, overall, I think these are really good steps made by the Biden administration for controlling housing and making housing in the United States a whole lot more affordable and accessible. We have people getting kicked out of their houses and their rental properties right now. They have nowhere to go. The federal government sort of stepping in this way kind of gives a lot more protections to an entire group of people that have never had them before. However, this is only the beginning of the entire conversation because what it doesn't do is sort of address the deep-rooted problems that we have with housing in the United States. But that is it for today's business and financial news breakdown. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to stay up to date with all the top business and financial news from around the country, our team puts together a free daily newsletter, and you can subscribe to it by clicking the link in this corner right here. And if you want to stay up to date with me and everything else happening in the business and financial world, I'm putting out updates 7 days a week over here on this channel, and I've actually got another one ready for you right here, so be sure to check that out before you go. That is it for me, everybody. Be kind out there, and I'll see you all in the next one.